Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much again for being here. I'm Anna Gassman-Pines. I am a faculty member in the Sanford School of Public Policy and a faculty affiliate of the Duke Center for Child and Family Policy, and I'm just delighted to see such a great turnout today. Before I introduce our guest, I do have a few words about logistics and housekeeping. So I am so glad to see so many of you. If you would keep yourselves on mute during this talk so that we can make sure that we all get a chance to hear Professor Conwell, that will be great. He is planning to speak for around 40 minutes. So he will be giving his presentation for 40 minutes, at which point we will open it up to questions for 15 minutes. So we will make sure to hold aside time for questions. We really look forward to having a chance to hear from you. You may submit questions at any time via the Zoom chat function, and we'll put them into a queue. And so we will be happy to take questions as you think of them in that Zoom chat function. And we will then ask them of Professor Conwell at the end of his presentation. Thank you so much. So it is my pleasure to be introducing Dr. Jordan Conwell for our first Early Childhood Initiative seminar series of this strange year in this unusual format. The Early Childhood Initiative, established by the Center for Child and Family Policy here at Duke, seeks to bring together scholars from across Duke to address challenges related to the early childhood period. The seminar series speakers range across disciplines, but all share an interest in bringing cutting-edge science to bear on policies affecting young children. And so I'm delighted to introduce Professor Jordan Conwell, an assistant professor in the departments of Sociology and Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Conwell's research focuses on trends and consequences of racial, social class, and gender inequality in education, with a particular interest in the multi-generational roles of families and finances in these educational processes as inputs for children and as outputs for adults. His recent studies have appeared in journals including Journal of Marriage and Family, Sociology of Education, and Urban Education. Dr. Conwell completed his PhD in sociology at Northwestern University in 2017. And during the 2020-2021 academic year, he will be a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jordan Conwell.
Thanks, Anna, for that really nice introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. I want to first thank the folks at Duke and Sanford and the Early Childhood Policy Center for inviting me, and Erica and Anna in particular for setting up this visit and making everything work in the midst of these crazy circumstances. I've really enjoyed the meetings I've had this morning and looking forward to more this afternoon after the talk, and just appreciate everybody taking the time. I know this is a busy and bizarre time for all of us personally and professionally, and it's nice to kind of have this sense of normalcy and intellectual vibrancy and community for this visit. So I appreciate that. I'm going to start by sharing some slides, and then we'll get going. Okay, so hopefully everybody is seeing slides. Great. So you know who I am because Anna gave that very kind introduction. I want to note that the study I'm going to be talking about today is co-authored work with Heather Hill, who's at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington in Seattle. And Heather is here today. And the third author on this study is one of Heather's fantastic graduate students, Brenda Gellner, at the Evans School. So I want to acknowledge them. And this has been a long-term team effort on this particular paper that I'm going to be the one presenting today. So the study is Race, Income and Wealth, and Parental Spending on children's education and care. I'm going to start with two-part background discussion. We're talking about inequality in parental investments in children, and then specifically about the intersection of racial, ethnic, and economic disadvantage in childhood. Go through our data and methods, talk about some results. As I'll note, this study includes families with children from birth to age 18. Given that this is an early childhood talk, I'm going to show you some sets of supplementary analyses that just include our early child households, so families with children who are early childhood, and actually some interesting kind of comparisons and contrasts with the results for the full range of child age, and then some discussion. So parental investments in children. This is a key mechanism by which parents facilitate children's development. So we can think of economic theories like human capital development from Becker and a lot of other past and current research and theory on this. Specifically, investments in children are theorized to facilitate their better care and education, as well as more developmentally supportive home environments. We actually have a limited amount of empirical evidence of this direct link. We kind of assume it from a two-part process. And the first part is that higher parental income, higher income parents are more likely to use center-based childcare, higher quality early childhood education, private schooling, other forms of educational supplements. And we know that those, of course, are consistently and positively associated with children's school achievement and their behavioral outcomes. Since the 1970s, parents have increased these forms of investments in children. And in the 1990s, these investments began shifting away from the adolescent years towards the early childhood years and the transition to adulthood. So the spending is kind of bifurcated into the early and late stages of child and young adult development. These increases in spending on children are greater than the increases in spending overall. And this implies that over these last 40 or 50 years, households have actually been redirecting resources towards children's education and care. At the same time, inequalities in these investments between high versus low income families have also increased. So this is a graph from a study by Cornrich and Furstenberg that appeared in Demography in 2013. And we're looking at spending on children by income decile across a number of time periods. The key takeaway here is that between 1972-73 and 2006-2007, inequality in spending on children between high versus low income households doubled from about $5,000 in 1972-73 to about $10,000 in 2006-2007. This graph looks like a lot of other graphs of social inequality in various domains that we've seen, right? This is not necessarily a story of the bottom falling back or the middle falling back. This is a story of the top pulling away from everyone else. In this case, that's also happening in spending on children. So a question is, why has this happened? A couple explanations are worth noting here. First, structural changes in the economy and cultural changes in parenting and child development. So in the economy, income inequality has also grown over this period in a shape that looks very much like the graph I just showed you. And this predicts, as Daniel Schneider and colleagues have shown, higher income inequality predicts greater inequality in spending on children. Over this same time period, this 40 or 50 years here, we've also seen an increase in women's labor force participation, and this has brought about more need for fee-based non-parental care, particularly among more highly educated and married couples. Culturally, one explanation here is concerted cultivation. So spending on children is one of a number of strategies that socioeconomically advantaged parents use to build multiple dimensions of children's capital, human, social, and cultural. And in particular, this culture of child rearing is associated with white, middle, and upper income families, and it has intensive demands on family resources, both in terms of time and money. Despite this, we know much less about racial ethnic differences in parent spending on children, as well as how racial ethnic and economic advantages and disadvantages may have interactive or intersectional effects on spending. So our key question here is, do households that have the same income but different racial and ethnic backgrounds spend the same amount on children's education and care? And this is an area where we have competing hypotheses about what might be happening. So first, there's the possibility that parental spending on children will be equal by race within income. We know from a lot of work that parental attitudes and beliefs about education do not vary by race. So we know that families of color place a very high value on children's education and care. And this suggests that there may not be differences in spending, particularly once income is equalized. So LaRue famously found no differences in the practice of concerted cultivation between white and Black families within the class types in her study. But there's also the possibility that the spending will differ by race within income. There's a lot of theory and recent empirical evidence on this, coalescing around the finding that economic disadvantage or advantage is experienced differently depending on race, ethnicity. Our child development scholars in the room will be familiar, for example, with Garcia Cole's model of development for children of color, the key premise of which is that class position as it relates to child development is mediated through racism. So, for example, segregated neighborhoods and schools shape parenting practices and children's development. So this leads us to think about trying to put together an explanatory framework for racial ethnic differences between same income households that may explain differences in spending on children. So just to reemphasize, what we're doing here is thinking about a situation where income is equalized. So income is not going to be the reason per se that the spending is different. So what else might be varying by race net of income that may account for different potential differences in spending on children? And we're going to be working here today with kind of a three-part explanatory framework. So first, household characteristics, which we know are correlated with spending on children and may vary by race net of income. Marital status and household size. This includes households of color having a higher likelihood of being multi-generational, so household resources, that same income being split across larger numbers of people, children, and adult family members. Other socioeconomic status characteristics like education. So I've done some work in this area, some others have done as well. Same income Black and white households have comparable levels of educational attainment, right? So equal educational attainment, that's what we would expect in a same income comparison. But Hispanic households remain at a disadvantage in education relative to white households with the same income. And then lastly, wealth. We know that there are large Black, white, and Hispanic white wealth gaps between households that have the same income. And recent work by Christine Percheski and your colleague Christina Gibson-Davis at Duke has shown that racial wealth gaps, Black, white wealth gaps, are actually larger among households with children than among other households. There are a number of ways that wealth may directly and indirectly relate to spending on children. So liquid assets, of course, can be used like income. Debt may place credit constraints on families and their ability to spend. And both assets and debts may indirectly affect spending through giving parents a subjective sense of financial stability in ways that affect spending decisions with their liquid assets. At least one study has looked at Black-white differences in spending on children, in that case, children aged 5 to 18, net of parental socioeconomic status characteristics, and this is a paper by Howe and Young. And that study used the PSID data and conditional quantile regression techniques and found Black-white differences in total spending on children of about 20 to 30% across the conditional distribution of spending on children. We make a couple contributions and build on this study and this literature in a number of ways. First, we're going to include Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and whites. So there's more comprehensive coverage of racial and ethnic groups is more in line with the contemporary demographic reality of families and children. In the US, our study is going to include early childhood, so we're going to focus on children birth to age 18 as opposed to 5 to 18. And as I noted at the beginning of the talk, we're also going to include some supplementary analyses that we're going to talk about today that are just for children in the early childhood period. And we're also going to look at racial and ethnic differences in spending at different points in the unconditional household income distribution. So this is kind of a little bit of a wonky methodological point. But a lot of what I've showed you and talked about and a lot of the theories about what's going on here are looking at low, middle, and high income households in an absolute sense, not in a quantile framework. So I think what we're going to be doing is more in line with previous research on inequality between these types of households, and the comparisons are a little more straightforward than they would be on the quantiles. Now, we have two main research questions. Do same income, white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian households with children aged 0 to 18 report different spending on education and care for children? And we're going to look at spending in two ways. We're going to first look at the probability of spending at least $1, that binary, which is in and of itself an important dimension of inequality. And then differences in the amount of spending among those who spend at least $1. We're also going to look at the extent to which any Black, white, Hispanic, white, and Asian white differences in the probability and amount of spending are explained by differences in that three-part framework I outlined earlier. So household characteristics, highest education in the household, and household wealth. Our data come from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is sponsored by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics within the Department of Labor. The survey covers expenditures, income, and demographic characteristics of a representative sample of what are called consumer units in the United States. I have a definition of consumer units there for those who are interested. This is basically a household or groups of people who make spending decisions together. We're going to be using the interview survey, which tracks data on major and or recurring purchases, and it's collected quarterly. Our observation period runs from Q2 of 2011 through Q4 of 2017. So this is starting at the end of the Great Recession and running through the most recently available data. So we define our sample. The consumer unit has to have at least one child below the age of 18, and at least one parent older than 24 to allow for the modal completion of schooling. This results in a sample of just over 38,000 consumer unit quarters across just under 15,000 unique consumer units. And our analysis is going to account for the clustering of quarters within consumer units. Our primary outcome is spending on children's education and care. And we're going to be talking today about a total spending measure that's a sum of three forms of parental investment that are collected in the survey. So this is going to be a sum of lessons, which are fees for recreational lessons and other instruction, schooling, student room and board, school meals, books, supplies, and equipment for school, tuition, and any other pre-K through 12th grade school-related expenses, and childcare. So any costs for babysitting, nannies, daycare centers, and nursery schools. This follows previous research that has also used this data set, including the Howe and Young and Formigen, Furstenberg, and Schneider studies that I mentioned earlier. So we also want to note what is not in this measure, right? This is not including clothes, food, things of that nature. So we want to note when I'm going to be talking about total spending, that I may use that shorthand, I'm talking about total spending on children's education and care, not total spending on the child in an absolute sense. We're going to adjust that spending to 2017 dollars using the Consumer Price Index. So an important thing about these spending outcomes is they're zero inflated. There are lots of zeros. There are many households that do not spend on lessons, schooling, or childcare. For example, if your child is going to a public school, which is free, you're using family-based childcare, and you are not paying for any lessons, right? So we have a lot of households that report zero. And we believe that that zero, instead of putting it into an average or something like that, or dropping the zeros, we want to analyze and model that zero. We believe that that's an important dimension of understanding what's going on here with family spending on children. So we're going to estimate binary probabilities of spending at least $1 on this total of those three forms, and then continuous differences in spending among those who do spend at least $1. Our key explanatory variables are race and income. So race is the race or ethnicity of the person who owns or rents the home and responds to the survey. We're going to be talking, as I noted, about white non-Hispanics, black non-Hispanics, Asian non-Hispanics, and Hispanics. There are Native American non-Hispanics and multiracial non-Hispanic individuals in the Consumer Expenditure Survey. We're going to exclude them due to relatively small sample sizes. Our income measure is pre-tax income in the last 12 months, which comes to us imputed in the Consumer Expenditure Survey. Is based on a number of sources that are listed there on the slide. We're also going to adjust this to 2017 dollars using the Consumer Price Index, and we're analyzing income here as percentiles, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. So our explanatory variables are going to fall into those, other explanatory variables are going to fall into those three buckets that I've been outlining. So household characteristics, family structure, whether there are two or more earners in the household, household size, whether the household contains at least one non-parent person over the age of 64, and the age and gender composition of the children in the household, and that age of children variables that I'm going to be using to present those supplementary early childhood analyses. We're also going to look at the highest education in the household, high school graduate or less, some college or associate's degree, and bachelor's degree or higher. We're going to proxy wealth based on the property value of the household's primary residence, following some work by Fabian Pfeffer, who's shown that in the absence of a measure of wealth, property value is an adequate proxy. And also following that work, those who rent report not owning a home are going to be included as zero on the property value. And there's been a lot of work showing that the performance of that works pretty well as a proxy. We're also going to adjust wealth to 2017 dollars with the CPI and convert that to percentiles, and everything we show you is going to control for region and year. So our main analytic model, we're going to organize the data, as I mentioned, into a consumer unit quarter structure. And the results we're going to show you are all going to come pretty much out of this model that is going to regress the parental spending on an interaction of race and income percentile. So that's the beta 3 in this equation here, beta 3. And that's going to allow us to show you for Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian families spending at the 10th, 50th, and 90th income percentiles in a pretty straightforward descriptive way. So we're going to do the analysis in 3 stages. We're first going to predict the probability and amount of spending by race at those 3 income levels, representing respectively low, middle, and high income families. And we're going to predict probability of spending with a linear probability model using this equation here, and then amount of spending based on a linear regression among those who spent at least $1. I just want to emphasize that when we're talking about the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentiles, again, these are same income apples to apples comparison. So these are the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentiles of the overall income distribution, not race specific. And one of the nice characteristics of this model is that the standard errors on these estimates are going to adjust to reflect the uncertainty of the differential sorting of families by race across income. So we're going to have, we're going to accurately reflect some of the imprecision of our estimates, for example, of very high income Black and Hispanic households, because there are a few of them, but we're still going to be able to talk about them based on this model. The second part of the analysis, we're going to predict all those explanatory variables, those 3 buckets that I've been talking about, by race at the same income levels. We're going to do that just by rotating each of those variables as the outcome in that same model for spending, and then we're going to derive descriptive statistics by race at those income levels. And then lastly, we're going to talk about to what extent does racial variation in those explanatory variables, net of income, account for racial variation, net of income, in probability and amount of spending. So we're going to rerun those models from the first part of the analysis. We're going to focus on that race and income interaction term, that beta 3, in this case, net of explanatory variables. Okay, so the results are going to be in 3 parts. I'll just emphasize that what I'm going to show you is going to include analyses of all households with children, and then the subset of what we're calling early child households. And the definition of early child households for today is households that reported all of their children are under 6, where the oldest child was ages 6 to 11, and at least one of the children is under 6. So we'll start there. Okay, this is a graph of the probability of spending at least $1 on children's care and education by race and income percentiles. And one thing that sticks out when looking at this graph is a distinction between Black and Hispanic households, so Blacks in red, Hispanics in yellow, and white and Asian households, whites in blue, Hispanics in green. So that is one way that it looks like this is cutting. And particularly striking are the patterns for Asian households and the increase in Asian households' probability of spending on children as income increases, such that at the lowest income level, 10th income percentile, they're falling in between Blacks and Hispanics, reaching about parity with whites at the median of income, and then among high income families report the highest probability of spending of these 4 racial groups. A little more formally in a table here, so these are the differences in probability of spending relative to white non-Hispanic. So what you see for white non-Hispanic here are their probabilities of spending, and then for the other 3 groups, differences in the probability of spending relative to whites at these 3 income levels. So for Black households relative to white households, probability of spending increases as income increases, as we'd expect. For Black households, less likely to spend, reported spending at least $1 on children at all these income levels, with this disadvantage increasing and becoming more significant as income increases. For Asian households, the effect that I just described, significantly less likely than white households to spend at the lowest income level, and flipping all the way to a significantly higher probability of spending at the highest income level. Hispanic, significant disadvantages relative to whites across the income distribution, and those are increasing as income increases. So this is the exact same thing, but this is the subset of household quarters that are those early childhood households that I described earlier. And a couple things of note. First of all, the probability of spending in early childhood overall is higher. So for example, 55% of white non-Hispanic households at the 90th income percentile, this highest income group, report spending on children of all ages, and that's 2/3 among early child households. So this is consistent with some of the work I described earlier, with families pushing some of this spending into the early childhood years. Black non-Hispanic households continue to be disadvantaged relative to white households. Disadvantage is only significant at the median income level. A big difference in this pattern for Asian households relative to moving from disadvantage to advantage, like I talked about for all households. Disadvantages at all income levels for this early childhood spending, although they are decreasing and becoming less significant with income. And for Hispanics, the same pattern, significant disadvantages across the income distribution. So some notable similarities and differences when comparing all households to early child households. This graph is set up the same way as the one I just showed you, except the outcome here is the log of the amount spent on children's care and education among those spending at least $1 by race and income percentile. Here it looks, some patterns are changing. Asian households in green, consistently the highest spenders among spenders across the income distribution. Black households in red and white households in blue hanging together across the income distribution, and Hispanic households, again, reporting the lowest spending among those who do spend. So here's the same information in table form. The setup is the same as the table I showed you earlier. So for whites, we have the amount of spending, and its logs have exponentiated that. We know that exponentiating the log predictions doesn't exactly, there's a little bit of bias in moving from log dollars to dollars in this way, but this gives a sense of what the dollar amount of spending is. And we see for whites that, as we would expect, that the amount of spending among spenders increases quite substantially as income increases from a little bit less than $200 per quarter at the 10th income percentile to just under $900 per quarter at the top income percentile. Black households who spend disadvantaged, although not significantly, relative to whites at the lowest income level. And this actually flips all the way to an advantage, although not a significant one, among those at the highest income level. Asians advantage at each income level relative to whites, and this advantage increases and becomes more significant with income. Hispanics disadvantage at each income level, but that disadvantage, the lower spending, is disadvantage is getting smaller as income increases. This is, again, our early childhood sample. We see, using that rough kind of exponentiation of the log prediction, that among whites, the amount of spending in early childhood is higher on average at each income level than for all households. So the highest income whites here at the 9th income percentile, spending just under $900 per quarter for all children, compared to $1,400 per quarter for early child households. And also some differences here in these racial ethnic differences relative to white. So for example, for Black households, advantages and significant advantages at the 50th and 90th income percentiles in spending, a different patterning for Asian households relative to whites. And although none of these are significant, disadvantage at the lowest income level, flipping to some higher spending at the top income level. And for Hispanics, the significant lower spending at the 10th and 50th income percentiles, and a non-significant, although higher spending at the top income level. So again, some notable comparisons and contrasts between all households and our early child households. I want to run through a few more tables here, some selected descriptive statistics on these explanatory variables by race, and I'm going to only be talking about median income households in this case, just for parsimony. So these are the first bucket of explanatory variables, family characteristics by race for a median income household. And again, our prior expectations for tables like this come from average racial ethnic differences in these characteristics. I'll just reemphasize again that what we're looking at here is an apples to apples comparison of households that have median income. So many of the differences that we expect to see, we may not see, and that's why. But a number of the differences that we see in average differences do persist net of income. For example, in family structure, Black households remain significantly less likely than median income white households to have married family structure, although Asian and Hispanic households at this income level are more likely than white households to have this structure. For some of these other variables, just to summarize, households of color, median income households of color, significantly more likely than median income white households to be larger and to be multi-generational. Median income Black households are significantly less likely than median income white households to have all their children under 6. The same is true of Hispanic households, whereas Asian households at this income level are more likely to have this structure, over a quarter of them having all children under 6. Educational differences that we see follow some previous research on educational differences at the intersection of race and income. So we see few differences between white and Black median income households. in education, significant educational advantages for median income Asian households. For example, just under 2/3 reporting a bachelor's degree or higher as their highest level of education, compared to just under half of white households at this income level, and significant disadvantages in educational attainment for Hispanic households at this income level. This begs the question, for example, why is our model predicting those Hispanic households to be at this income level, given educational disadvantages and the reality of racial discrimination in the labor market? One of the answers for this comes in the family characteristics, as Hispanic households at this level are more likely to report having 2 or more income earners, and they're larger. So there are different routes. The descriptive statistics are showing us are some of the different routes that families take to get to this income level. And our question is, do those different routes have different implications for spending on children? Lastly is our wealth proxy, property value, and we see what we would expect here as well from previous research. White non-Hispanic households at the median income level have average property values just below the median of that distribution, about the 47th percentile. Median income Black non-Hispanic households are at about the 32nd percentile of the distribution of property value. No significant difference between whites and Asian households, and Hispanic households also significantly lower property values than white households at this median income level, at about the 36th percentile of property value. So our last question here is, does some of that descriptive variation account for differences in the probability and amount of spending between same income households? So I'm bringing back the table I showed you earlier. These are differences in probability of spending relative to white non-Hispanic households. We're going to focus still on that median income comparison for the sake of example. And we have 2 significant differences in the probability of spending that we want to see to what extent we can explain. So this is the significant disadvantages in probability of spending for median income Black households relative to median income white households, and median income Hispanic households. So these 2 disadvantages, to what extent can we explain those with those buckets of explanatory variables? So this graph is showing the percentage of that difference, these differences, accounted for by each of these groups of potential explanations. And the big takeaway here is differences by race and the extent to which these variables account for differences in spending. So overall, all these variables entered into the model together explain just under 45% of that Hispanic white difference in the probability of spending, compared to just under 25% of the Black white difference in probability of spending. We've been very interested, as we've been working on this study, in the role of wealth in particular. And so we see that our wealth proxy, property value, entered on its own as the explanatory variable, accounts for about 15% of the Black-white difference in probability of spending, and just over 5% of the Hispanic-white difference. So bringing back another table, this time the difference in log dollars spent among those spending at least $1, focusing still on this median income for the sake of example. Here we are looking at the significant differences that we're looking to explain a significant advantage for Asian households at this income level relative to whites, and a significant disadvantage for Hispanic households. So we see Asian white differences here in blue, Hispanic white differences in gray. Accounting for family characteristics, this negative explanatory power, the negative percentage, is showing that accounting for family characteristics, the Asian white difference actually gets larger to the advantage of Asian households, whereas the Hispanic white difference gets smaller by about 10%. In total, these variables explain half of the Hispanic white difference in the amount spent, and actually very little, just a couple percent overall of the Asian white difference. About a third of that difference is accounted for in the model where we just enter education on its own. So recap of our main findings as I'm wrapping up. So we've been looking throughout the study at same income comparisons relative to whites. For Blacks, what we look like we have here is kind of a hurdle, which is lower probability of spending, but equal or sometimes higher spending among those who do spend. And this points back to the importance of looking at the 0-1 binary that we've been looking at as a hurdle into spending. For Hispanics relative to same income whites, lower probability and amount of spending. For Asians relative to same income whites, higher probability and amount of spending. We also showed in some of the supplementary analyses of the early childhood households only, these patterns vary substantially by income level and child age. So again, early childhood spending versus all spending, some different patterns that we would like to investigate, and looking forward to talking about some of those in the Q&A today. And these differences in spending are partially accounted for by racial variation in the correlates of spending, net of income, particularly Hispanic white differences. Some of the different routes that Hispanic households are taking to attain this income level are also correlates of spending on children. Couple implications. Of course, a lot of research recently has paid attention to gaps by parental income in children's educational achievement in K-12, as well as their eventual educational attainment. And these differences in spending may be related to that, and may be part of the explanation for racial differences in educational achievement and attainment that persist net of parental income. It's important to note, kind of more broadly though, this is one form of parenting, and this is a financially and time-intensive form of parenting, and these patterns could differ for other ways of operationalizing parent-child dynamics in the household and parenting, such as time with children and cultural socialization. And those definitions, those outcomes could compound or offset the inequalities in spending that we found here, and those other outcomes are also known correlates of child development. So by no means do we want the takeaway here to be that we think this is the one form of child development or the one form of opportunities for children. That's very much not the case, although this is one that we know is correlated with a number of later outcomes for children. One of the limitations of the study is we don't have data on neighborhood characteristics. We know that neighborhoods, access to high quality neighborhoods vary substantially by race, net of income, and lower quality neighborhoods, of course, could constrain Black and Hispanic parents' spending opportunities relative to same income whites and Asians if you're not in a neighborhood that has the same number of opportunities for you to spend for high quality opportunities for children. So there's very much a spatial aspect to this question, and that's one of many fruitful areas for future research. So I will stop there, and looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that really interesting talk.
Yeah.
So I know our Zoom setting is a little bit challenging to mimic what it would be like if we were all together in person, but we do want to try to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions for Professor Conwell, please put them into the chat, and I will share them with him, and we can have a dialogue going. While you're thinking about what you want to ask him, I will take the host prerogative to ask the first question.
Sure.
So one thing that I was thinking about and wondered if you were able to measure in kind of trying to crosswalk the differences between the spending on children of all ages with that early childhood spending. And it really seemed like the Black-white differences got smaller when you focused on early childhood, which makes me wonder about kind of the use of childcare and the role of women's employment in particular. So you showed us this measure of having two earners, but I'm trying to think a little bit, or help. I'm wondering if you can help me think through kind of the notion that there are more single parent households among your Black households,
Right.
and that Black women have a longer history of being wage earners and have higher employment rates than white women. And I'm trying to think through, and hoping you can help me, kind of really thinking through women's employment in particular, mothers' employment, and the need for childcare as it's driving these expenditures.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're not looking at closely here, and I think it's partially due to some limitations of the data, is like a big factor here is maternal employment, right? And maternal employment as it relates to family structure. So yes, when I was struck as you were looking at early childhood households, those significantly higher spending among median and high income Black households relative to median and high income white households. So yet this leads to the question, is this a situation where, and we know also at a given income level that Black women's labor force attachment is stronger than white women's attachment, in part due to discrimination faced by Black men in the labor market and the need to get so the question is always, how is the household getting to this income level?
Right.
And then what does that imply? So I could totally see that scenario happening where it's a need for childcare, and that actually makes me think that something that we should do for those early childhood results is look, because we're using the totals, right? But we have the components, and so what I think you're suggesting, or the implication of what you're suggesting, is that we would see that would come out. The difference would be childcare, right?
I think that's right. That's right. Yep, that's what I'm suggesting. And yeah, I think you could start to piece that apart by looking at the subcomponents of the spending. Yeah. I'm delighted to see so many questions in the chat. So I'm going to just start feeding those right to you. I don't want you to worry about the chat. I will take care of that.
Okay.
One is a clarification question around lessons. If you could just say a little bit more about what's included there. Is it exclusively academic, or would it include things like dance lessons or karate or something of that nature? And how does that maybe, what does that make us think about how parents are using this spending?
Yeah, as far as we know, it would, right? Because the lessons is fees for recreational lessons and other instruction. So we, I'm a sociologist, so that makes me think of kind of the concerted cultivation, the piano lessons, the karate, the swimming, all that. This also relates to the point that I ended with, which is I talk about the differences in spending as advantage and disadvantage. That's how we talk about things. But it also mattered, the neighborhood thing matters here as well, right?
Right.
Do you as a family live in an area where there are opportunities to spend on those kind of things? Like if there's not a kids karate gym around, or there aren't, all kind of different music lessons and things around, the lack of spending is not necessarily a disadvantage in the way that we think about it. It may be that you don't have things to spend money on. So it's a different way of thinking about this disadvantage.
Yeah. A lot of curiosity around subsidies, especially for childcare. So how would we think about here, say reimbursable childcare fees? Is that taken into account when you look at this kind of spending? And how do we think about that in relation to your findings?
Yeah, to my knowledge, that's not taken into account here. We need to take a closer look and see. Yes, and so this is just another example of talking about these advantage and disadvantage, right? If you have access to a subsidy, that may mean that you don't have to spend, or the spending is going to be reimbursed. So that's something to keep in mind. Neighborhoods come back in again. in that the zeros could, like, especially for schooling and for childcare, you could be in a situation where there are free services as well. So you think about subsidy and reimbursement, we could also think about the access to free services, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what we have, but those are all kind of boundary conditions for what we're showing.
Right, and I think also different kinds of real or perceived discrimination. So especially thinking about your Hispanic families, depending on their family's immigration status, especially and the citizenship and immigration status of the children, parents may feel more or less able or willing to access either free services or programs that their children are eligible for, but they may be concerned about implications for their family in terms of their own immigration status.
Yeah, so a practice of system avoidance. Yeah, given that that's definitely a possibility that we need to explore, at least have in our discussion, which is that if you're in an area situation where, like, there are services available, but they're provided by a state or local government agency, you may say, well, we don't want to be involved in that, or we don't want to sign up for that subsidy to go use it however we want because of potential surveillance. Definitely.
Yeah, a question coming up in the chat actually builds on my point a little bit, which is wondering whether there is immigration status in this data, and whether that may be a potential explanatory variable that could.
Okay, I'll have to look. I'm going to guess, given that it's publicly available, no, but potentially, or maybe even like maybe even a birth in the U.S. versus not. I'm going to guess no in terms of having some detailed information about, like, a legal status type thing. So generation, may be possible, but status, I'm going to guess not.
Yeah, and I think we can certainly share this chat with you afterwards as well. I think there's this person's in particular kind of really, I think, pushing you all to think a little bit about how ethnicity and immigration status may be intersecting here, and, for example, relate to, like, the model minority myth for Asians, especially across the income percentiles, and potentially how kind of generation status or immigration status is playing out here. So to the extent that you might be able to look at some of that.
Yeah, and I'll throw in, right, so when we're talking about Hispanics and Asian non-Hispanics, these are big, and I think this is part of the question that the person's asking, these are big, diverse groups with different migration histories, right? And subgroups within the population that have very different experiences of education, employment, raising children in the U.S., right? So this is especially for those groups, but for Blacks and whites as well, but particularly for those groups, painting with a really broad brush, certainly.
Okay, a pretty detailed question about your models here.
Oh, okay.
So I'm actually gonna read it all out because I think it'll be easier to answer if I give you the full context. So this person is asking about the models and saying he believes that the first model is the descriptive, unadjusted differences between the race categories within income. Mm-hmm. And then the later models add covariates. Mm-hmm. Is it correct that these later models adjust those race differences to the average of the covariate distribution? So what he's wondering is, could there be a modeling approach that would allow each income quartile to have its own covariate distribution? Something like a multiple groups model.
Yes. So yes and yes. So what I showed you does adjust to the mean of the covariate distribution. So there is a little bit of a disconnect between, so this is the median income, but everybody has the mean. And some of my other work that's looked at these race income comparisons or race education comparisons, there is, and it's really just a plug and chug approach, right? So you could do the full counterfactual where you could actually take the covariate distribution of, say, whites at 90th percentile and repredict Black, Hispanics, and Asians spending this is Robert's, but we've had this conversation a little bit earlier. And you actually repredict at the 90th. So you can make this as exact as you want. I have a paper that's forthcoming in Sociology of Education where I do this for race and income and children's achievement, and the model is fully interactive. So I've let all the covariates are interacted with income, and then you repredict, in that case, Black's high school math scores with the covariates of same income whites. So you're assuming that the effects differ by income, but they do so without racial differences. And then you're saying, okay, so what if in that case Blacks had the same covariate values as whites and received the same returns? So you can get as fine grained with that as you want. And really, it's algebraically, it's just plug and chug. You take the descriptives, you put it in, and you repredict.
So we are, based in a policy school, and as we're getting to the end of our time together, I think there are a lot of us who would love to just hear you talk a little bit and reflect a little bit on what you think the policy implications are of this work, and what you might want policymakers to take away from these findings.
Yeah, I mean, so as a sociologist, the thing I always want to start that conversation with what we're measuring here, and we think about spending on children. Again, this is one way of thinking about child development. It is financially and time intensive, and it is historically and currently primarily, although not entirely, associated with white middle and upper middle class families. That said, we also have to acknowledge the ways that these opportunities are correlated with many, many future outcomes for kids. And so I'm always pushing for a more robust discussion of child welfare generally. Access to these opportunities should not, at least to some kind of base level of opportunities of these types, should not be so dependent on income. I mean, that's really the bottom line. The reason that a study like this is important is because we want to know who has access to these things, and that's because we're operating in a world that is somewhat independent from like uniform and high quality state provided versions of this prior to the entry to kindergarten, right? Where there are also huge inequalities in what that implies, although at least there's like some system there. So that's what I think kind of I guess the broad framing for the policy discussion would be. We need to, I would love, after doing this, to know more about how parents are thinking about this, even in a qualitative sense, right? There are complicated ways that policies that may already be going on, including ones that are very beneficial and equalizing for child development opportunities that we don't measure. Right? We talked about subsidies and things earlier. So I think we need to know a lot more before being able to make a really precise kind of policy recommendation. But I think I think like many in the room would love us to be having a more robust discussion about child welfare than we are.
Hear, hear. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for this really interesting presentation, for being here with us virtually today, and for sharing this really important work. I really, really appreciate it. For all of you who are in the audience, I want to call your attention to a few things that have been going on in the chat. First of all, we have a survey. We'd love to hear from you. It's a quick survey that is just designed to help us here at the Center for Child and Family Policy improve the way we do events. And if you have a moment to click on that survey link, we'd love your feedback about this and other events. And speaking of other events, we have some wonderful upcoming talks. The link to those are also in the chat. In 2 weeks, we're hosting Stephanie Curenton, who is talking about work she's doing in early childhood education settings, conducting anti-racist professional development with early childhood educators. And I think that promises to be a wonderful talk, so I encourage you to sign up to attend that one. And then our first Sulzberger Distinguished Lecturer of the Year is Diane Schanzenbach, and Diane Schanzenbach will be joining us next week. talking about building exactly on Professor Conwell's point, talking about how we are underinvesting in kids in the United States and what we can do about it. So we certainly hope you will join us for both Professor Curenton's ECI seminar and Professor Schanzenbach's Sulzberger lecture. I will just close by once again thanking Professor Conwell for being here and giving such a wonderful talk.
Oh,
Have a
thanks for
great
having
day,
me.
everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you so much, Jordan.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. This was really great.
Yeah, I think it went really well. It's super interesting work. I was excited to get a chance to hear about it.
Yeah, and the questions are really, so the thing that you suggested will actually be a paper that we're going to do, because I think the early childhood results in and of themselves, I think that could be like a child development type paper, and looking at the separate outcomes that we have and seeing what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. The early childhood, I totally think that can stand alone.
Yeah.
And I do think there's different and really interesting issues to think about around, especially around parental employment and,
okay. So I may
discrimination in the labor market.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I was also wondering too, with the Hispanic families, if they're bigger households and more likely to be intergenerational, whether that lowers their need for pay childcare, even when adults